Welcome to another episode of the Rhyme and Reason podcast, brought to you by the College of Arts and Humanities, which we call RHU at the University of Maryland. The Rhyme and Reason podcast is a series of riveting, provocative, fascinating discussions with some of our most compelling leaders in arts and humanities from the University of Maryland. Be sure to subscribe to the Rhyme and Reason podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts so you won't miss a single episode. I'm your host for the podcast, Stephanie Shanakan. I'm the proud Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities. Over the next few weeks, we're providing a series of race, equity, and justice conversations right here on the Rhyme and Reason podcast. We'll hear from folks across the RHU spectrum who are studying and thinking about these powerful ideas. So it's a great honor to welcome to the Rhyme and Reason podcast Nancy Mirabal, an associate professor in RHU's Department of American Studies, and I'm so thrilled that she's on this afternoon. Thanks so much for being here, Nancy.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Great.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're so welcome. So let me start by telling you a bit more about Nancy. Nancy joined Maryland's faculty in 2014, coming to UMD from San Francisco State University, which is in itself a legendary space that has done legendary things for all of us. The award-winning author of many books, articles, book chapters, Dr. Mirabal is a renowned scholar in the fields of Afro-diasporic and Latinx studies. Her 2017 book is entitled Suspect Freedoms, The Racial and Sexual Politics of Cubanidad in New York, 1823 to 1957. And it is the first book to explore the history of Cuban racial and sexual politics in New York during the 19th and 20th centuries. Nancy is on the advisory board for the Center for Global Migration Studies and an affiliate faculty with the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies, the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity, and the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Center. Busy, busy girl. So Nancy, let's jump right in. I'm so glad that you're here, and I'm so glad that you're on our faculty in American Studies. So let's start. If you could tell us a little bit about your current research and the efforts that you're currently pursuing. I'm particularly interested in the work you're doing on dissonant visibilities, uneasy archives, and Latinx spatial temporalities.
Thank you. That was a mouthful, right?
It was a mouthful. You're busy.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. That was such a lovely introduction. So I always tell folks that in my interest, I have two streams. One has always been Afro-diasporic studies within the field of Latinx studies. And I started that work almost 30 years ago. That was my dissertation. That was a lot of my research. And really what I was interested in there is why that history had not been written, even though it was very clear that that was an extensive and important history within the field of Latinx studies. So I continue to write on that. And I also have great interest in works around gentrification and race. And so when I was at San Francisco State University, I was in the College of Ethnic Studies. And one of the projects that I did was a community oral history project on the impact of gentrification on the Latinx community in the barrio in San Francisco, which is the Mission District. It was during the tech boom. Mm-hmm. It was during that particular moment of the 1990s and the early 2000s. And that was a moment when tech was really kind of trying to sell us on them being the future and egalitarian, and everyone has access to technology. And at the same time, they're pushing out these communities. And that's when I started then going in that realm and saying, what's going on here in terms of spatial displacement, dispossession? And what I became fascinated with is those who talk about gentrification, redevelopment, keep telling you that it's a class-based process. But we see that the disproportionate number of communities that are being affected are communities of color.
Sure.
So I was fascinated by that dissonance, and this is where we talk about spatial dissonance. Right. And so the project that I'm working on now is It's based on Cheryl Harris's brilliant article, Whiteness is Property, and mine is Whiteness is Gentrification, which is really kind of an ideological thinking through of the role that whiteness has historically played. And I go back to like 1790 with the Naturalization Act of 1790, that they had already decided that only white men could own property. And so if we start with 1790, we already see that this idea between race, whiteness in particular, and a gendered whiteness is already tied to space.
That's so powerful. And so, so I'm sitting here thinking about the conversation I had with two other guests on the podcast. Just last week, we talked with Madeline Shu about migration and what happens when people are displaced. And then earlier, we talked to Shelby Meisner about indigenous identities, and there again, land and ownership and who gets to define boundaries was a central part of that conversation. So it's interesting that thread is pulling through this series. So interesting too, as you talk about spatial dissonance within the United States. I'm thinking too about like the Bronx and places like that where families and communities were broken up when roads and bridges were built through. I think about that in the context of hip hop because that's why young people wanted to kind of speak up against that. So your work is certainly in conversation with Public Enemy.
Oh, good. That makes me very happy.
Right? I love it. So I'd love to hear you talk about what San Francisco State was like when you were there, and you were there for so long. But, that's a place that we think about in the history of Black studies, as the birthplace of this kind of work. Tell me about the energy when you were there.
Well, I was there for 18 years. I directed the Master's in Ethnic Studies.
Wow.
I got tenure in the Latino Studies Department. It was also known as Raza Studies. And I think for me, it being my first job, what it taught me, and it was a great gift, I enjoyed. I'm still very close to all of my colleagues there, was the importance of community. And not just community in this notion of distant, but this community that they are part of why we do the work that we do. When I was at San Francisco State, if I would talk about the Chicano movement, I would get hands up and saying, "Oh yeah, that's my uncle. That's my brother. Oh, that's not how it happened, Dr. Mirabal." They would call me profe. "That's not how it happened, profe." So they had a certain intimate knowledge of the movement, of the community. And they saw ethnic studies as an extension of their family, of their neighborhood. So when we did the oral history project, all the students, they did the interviews, we came back, we were constantly working within community. We were Acción Latina, Galería La Raza, Instituto Cultural del Familiar, the Mission Cultural Center. That was who we were in conversations with. I had a colleague who started a clinic, and he started a clinic in the barrio for people who were underinsured. I had a colleague who did an education abroad program to Mexico. Another did an education abroad program to Cuba. Another started a newspaper. There were 3 or 4 literary journals in the college alone. We had 2 in our department, and then I did the community oral history project. We had prison projects. I had colleagues who would go into the prison and do work with the prison population. A core class was community activism. You had to take a course on one semester, what is community activism, how do you define it? And then the next semester, the students would be working in the community, putting that into place.
So it's very much putting what they're learning to practice.
Absolutely.
So there's a praxis and there's a learning and there's a praxis.
Yes. And and then they would meet and say, because it's one thing, a lot of times students will imagine what activism looks like, and it's always very positive and helping people. It's actually really, really hard work.
Of course.
And having to be, and this is the biggest lesson, often for academics can be a hard lesson, is to be humble, is to have absolute humility. You don't have the answers. They have the answers.
That's right.
And you have to be in service to that community.
and it's a position and a posture that Westerners are not used to.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. So that's what San Francisco State taught me is that kind of humility. You stand back and you listen.
It feels very much like that is still part of your blood. Like
Yeah.
that's what is moving you on. So I definitely want to sort of fast forward to what you're doing right now, because it feels very much as if your work is still within that framework. So let's shift to your work on the Grand Challenges Impact Award, which we are so proud that you were awarded this,
Thank you.
and you make the college shine. So thank you, Nancy. Can you tell us more about the Urban Equity Collective and how the collective is advancing equitable community change, which is the basis of the award that you got?
Yes, yes. And it is actually a collaborative, and the only reason I make that distinction is that we went in with this idea of, and it has been a challenge, of leadership without hierarchy. And so, what I was interested when I saw this call, I said, I'd really like to go back to that kind of work that I had been doing for so long. And I contacted one of my colleagues, which is Dr. Willow Lung Amam, who's done work with the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, and then another colleague, Dr. Devin Payne Sturgis, who's done incredible work around public health. So I said, okay, one of the conditions of this is that we have to be in different colleges. And how would you like to kind of come together and build one of the few of only women of color collaboratives that are dealing around issues of equity? And we said, let's do it. Let's try it, and let's try to build it. So really, we're just building it as we go along. And so how we put it together is very different in terms of discipline. What urban planning feels is important is very different from what public health thinks is important, and what I think is important as a humanities person. And so one of the things that I am proud of, and this is my part of the project, was to bring in an activist or an organizer on campus. We call them a community fellow. We give them a stipend for about 4 months of work. And what we do is we work with them. We are in service to their project. They're not. We should not be writing an article on their work. We should not be interviewing them. It is, what is it that you're doing, and how can we as an intellectual resource, and how can the university as an academic resource assist you in what you're doing? So for the person that I'm working with, she is retired. She works for 1DC. She's a tenant organizer. She has lived in Southeast DC for most of her life. And she's incredible. She goes by Miss J. And Miss J wants to do a community oral history of her building and how the tenant organizing started and where it's going. And I think what she really wants to do, and we talked about that, is to give visibility to Black women organizers, and not the ones that are, the big names, but the everyday kind of organizer who puts in that work to make sure that there are no evictions, that the rent doesn't get raised, that, that plumbing gets fixed. And so I feel very honored that she was willing to work with me. And so we're starting that kind of project right now of putting that together. Another person is Reverend Toussaint, who is an organizer with the Haitian community. And what he'd like to do, he's working with Dr. Payne Sturgis, is to create a census. He just wants to know how many migrants are out here and what are their living conditions and how can we help them. Well, that's something that we can help him with, right? And then Jen Tran is an activist with Eden Rock, which is a Vietnamese business center. And they're facing evictions. They're looking at gentrification. And so Dr. Long Among with the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network is perfectly suited to say, okay, what I've done here in Langley Park around the Purple Line, let's go ahead and see if we can do that for you at Eden Rock.
I love that. I love that you and the collaborative, you are putting UMD to work.
To work.
For the
Yes,
community,
yes.
right? And not the other way around, which is so usually the case with these big research institutions that are planted in places where people live and have lived for many, many years.
And to be bottom up as opposed to top down.
Absolutely, absolutely. As an expert in Latinx studies, I'm wondering about your thoughts on the relationship between race and immigration, especially as we think about the southern border and what is happening right now. So we're recording this in 2024. What are your thoughts as a scholar, but also as a human being who has been thinking about this for many, many years? What are your thoughts on the discourse?
Well, first of all, I think the fact that you use the term discourse is perfect, and absolutely right on target. I'm from California. I was born in East LA. I grew up in Los Angeles. I was raised around immigrants, children of immigrants, my entire life. And immigration was just immigration. Okay, it was just you came in. Sure, there was a lot of racism because we moved into communities that had been all white, and then that had shifted and changed, and there was a lot of racism around that, which I think also informed my interest around gentrification, and I got to see what whiteness looks like up front, when you're not wanted.
That's right.
But it was immigration, and then something happens with Pete Wilson and Proposition 187 and the SOS and this discourse of villainizing people who are doing what human beings have done for hundreds of years. And what happens is that it becomes a very powerful tool for the right wing. So it is no coincidence that at the same time that you see that demographic shift, that we have this rhetoric that's just been through the roof and known as the Latino threat and all of this, horrible way of identifying a population. I was listening to someone on NPR, and it was an organizer and it was an older man who was just, there to help. And he said, over 100 years ago, if not more, we had Ellis Island, and we knew how to deal with immigrants then. We had them come in. We did the paperwork. And
welcomed them.
We welcomed them, and we survived that.
That's
and
right.
He's like, well, I don't know why we can't do that here.
Right.
Why there hasn't been, a certain kind of interest in just creating a policy, provide amnesty. A lot of other countries do it this way. And what he said was, and I think it's right, it's become too much of a hot topic for certain politicians. The thing is that real people pay the price.
Right.
When you have family separations.
Oh, my goodness, yeah.
Also, what many folks don't realize is that it's not only migrants from Latin America coming. There's an increased number coming from China, a large number coming from Haiti, a large number coming from West Africa and North Africa. In fact, if you look at the statistics, I think 30 to 40% of the immigrants identify themselves as Black. And that is nowhere in this analysis, right? Because you also have migrants coming from the Caribbean.
That's right.
So it is a much more complicated story than they're dirty, they're taking our jobs, and we don't want them.
That's right.
The truth is, if you were to look at the economy definitely wants cheap labor. And so if you were to look at the
it needs it. Yeah.
If you look at the history of the U.S., it's always been these two tensions: cheap labor and trying to stay a white country.
I'm so proud of the work that you're doing and that so many in our college are doing. As humanists, we bear the responsibility to continue showing and parsing out the differences and the uniqueness in all of these journeys.
Absolutely.
So I'm so proud also, Nancy, that you're on the board of the Teaching for Change organization in Washington, D.C., as if you didn't have enough work to do.
Oh, yeah. There's other stuff. I can't say no. It's horrible.
I know. It's because there's so much work.
So much work.
And you want it done well and properly. Can you talk about the work you're doing at Teaching for Change and what the overall mission is for the organization?
Oh, my God. Teaching for Change is my heart.
It's so wonderful.
I just, it's my heart. And the executive director she just exemplifies humility and kindness and hard work.
Was she at the Douglas
She
Center?
was.
She was.
Her name is Deborah Menkart.
So humble.
Yes, and what people don't realize about her is that she was also a member of SNCC. This is a white woman.
Oh, she was also a member of
Yes,
SNCC. Okay.
this is a white woman who was a member of SNCC, who has really long, deep, respectful connections to the Black community in D.C. They love her. They respect her.
They trust her. It was so clear.
They trust her. And so the funny thing is, I was at a bookstore and I started chatting with her. I didn't know who she was. I just moved into the area. And she turns to me and she said, "Would you like to be on the board for Teaching for Change?" And I was like, "What is that? I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "Well, give me a year. I just kind of moved in." And then I saw her again somewhere else. And she said, "Look, whenever you want." And she just said she had an instinct about me. And then I said yes. And I started working with them. And what I realized was that they've been in the D.C. area, but across the country for 35 years. They're celebrating 35 years. And these are folks who oh my gosh, it's a Zen education project. It's Black Lives Matter in high schools. It's rethinking schools. It's the Black Freedom Movement. It's an incredible, just all of these different components that Deborah, through her leadership, is able to bring together. These are folks who really do work around educational activism and really believe in public schools and what public schools can and should do for us.
Yeah. And don't we need them right now?
Oh, my gosh.
Right?
They are, it's the kind of, I can't even tell you, I'm so proud to be part. And they deal with things head on. So when the textbooks, this whole thing about textbooks not wanting to include our histories, they fought head on and said, here are lesson plans. They would write up the lesson plans and distribute them to the teachers and say, if your textbooks isn't going to do it, we can do it for you. And, one of the things that we all know is that sometimes these books will save your life. You read the right book at the right moment, and I get chills because it will save your life, because it is, I'm not alone in this. There are other people. There is a community for me.
That's
I
right.
belong
That's
somewhere.
right.
And it's that power and the work. I always tell folks that we have to keep in mind that we must be doing something right. Again, I'm also horribly positive and optimistic that we must be doing something right, or the backlash wouldn't be so vigorous and so ferocious. So let's just keep doing something right and keep pushing forward. And
because it is all about power.
It is all about power.
And how we push back against the powers that continue to revolve around all of us, right?
Yes, and we have to be very clear and honest that for some people, not all, that it is a fear of their whatever they think their way of life is changing, whether it's Christianity, whether it's whiteness, whether it's gender, that there is a way that there are folks who have been convinced that their way of life is changing, and that now everyone who's not like them should be somehow destroyed.
That's right. And that's why I think I always say the arts and humanities
is central.
And that's what I love about what we teach, what we ask our students to read and think about. It's not telling them what to think, but it's giving them the information that they need to think for themselves. And when they think for themselves about who we are as human beings, then they start to kind of dismantle all the ideologies that they've grown up with in different parts of the world, and start thinking in fresh ways, because clearly the ways in which we've structured our economies, our democracies, have not worked.
And we will not have a future if we don't change the way we think, if we don't allow for different ideas.
That's right. Nancy, I could talk to you all day.
I know.
Clearly.
I know. we always have
going.
Such wonderful conversations.
We do. I want to just thank you so much for joining me today on the Rhyme and Reason podcast.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this discussion of some of the important questions concerning race, equity, and justice. Please join us again on the Rhyme and Reason podcast. And be sure to visit www.rhu.umd.edu to to learn more about the College of Arts and Humanities at the University of Maryland and our efforts to see a more equitable and just future for all of us. Thanks for listening.